Rick Berman, Dr. Evil. Thanks for joining the Confidential Bulletin podcast today.
Pleasure.
Before we patched in, I went down a rabbit hole actually this morning and last night and came across a couple articles. And so I'll just sort of set the table here and let me just sort of read some of the highlights, some of the quotes from various media outlets. Politico New York said that you're one of the nation's most prominent corporate activists. Chicago Tribune said you have a razor-sharp wit with unconventional tactics. The Boston Globe called you a pioneer in the realm of opinion molding. The Los Angeles Times called you a feisty, unapologetic warrior against what it sees as overregulation, which is, that was some time ago, and here we are again. You get around, clearly, with all these media outlets describing sort of what you do and how you do it. But then I came across a Huffington Post article. It was entitled, America's Ruling Class Hall of Shame. And, they go on to, state that there's, 300 million people in this country, and there's a few thousand who wield, disproportionate economic and political influence. And then it kind of narrows that field to 20 people whose influence is more potent within that class. And there you are, alongside Rupert Murdoch, Jamie Dimon, and 17 others. The article defines you as a sleazy corporate frontman. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say, first of all, it's consistent with who said it. Obviously a fairly liberal publication picking out everyone that they could find in America that was making a difference on the conservative side. Although I have to say, I remember that list. Sheldon Adelson was on there as well, an enormously, rich multi-billionaire, along with some of those others. And the right way for me to react is, if you looked at that list, you would say, what name on here doesn't belong? Because I definitely didn't belong with those guys. But nonetheless, I impressed somebody with the fact that I was a pretty strong conservative and representing clients accordingly.
So 60 Minutes some time ago did a profile of you, was Morley Safer, who sort of described you as a weapon of mass destruction for the industries you represent, which obviously the restaurant industry, you prominently represented the liquor industry. I mean, I know that, the movie Thank You for Smoking, a lot of people sort of said, that's Rick Berman. You kind of were known for, gleefully entering the left-leaning media lion's den and going, mercilessly attacking the likes of PETA, labor unions, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and others. Was there ever a point where you worried that, there'd be backlash for sort of your reputation, the Dr. Evil thing? Did you ever worry that could repel potential clients?
Well, most of our clients were very happy to see what I was doing. They were more than happy to pay for it, just as long as their fingerprints weren't on it. So even trade associations would say to me, you do the kind of things that we would love to do, but we don't have license to do it. And, I represented a group of people. Of course, the group changed from time to time, especially considering the issues changed. But I represented a group of people who from time to time had an appetite for playing hardball. They just knew that they had a brand that couldn't be compromised by getting out there, taking a position, and then getting attacked for it. But they were more than happy to have me go out there.
What do you love about your union?
You know what I love? Paying union dues, just so I can keep my job.
I think it's great that my union dues are going to politicians I don't even like.
I really like how the union discriminates against minorities.
Nothing makes me feel better than knowing that I'm supporting their fat cat lifestyles.
Corruption, discrimination, politics, and forced dues. Find out the facts about union officials at unionfacts.com.
Thanks, union bosses.
And, that Dr. Evil thing came from a guy who was the head of union organizing for the AFL-CIO. So, again, kind of like the Huffington Post, you kind of consider the source, and I took it as a badge of honor that they were so focused on me. And you have to remember that when I would go after some of these groups like PETA or MAD or whatever, I didn't go after the group just as a group. I went after the group for positions that they took that were inconsistent with the evidence or with logic. And that's what made it very difficult for there to be a real backlash, because I would say, look, these are my statistics. This is the evidence. Tell me what's wrong with my evidence. Now, admittedly, when I would position these groups and I was trying to reposition them from this, pedestal that they put themselves on, or they name themselves with these high-minded sounding names, the Center for Science in the Public Interest. How can you be against the Center for Science in the Public Interest? How can you be against Mothers Against Drunk Driving? I mean, people would at first recoil that you are going after these groups. And I say, well, I'm going after them because they trade in bad information. And here's the information that they're guilty of. And then people would kind of understand that, and they would at least give me the courtesy of acknowledging that perhaps some of what we were saying was correct and ought to be considered. That's all I ever thought was necessary to make the case, because those groups were trying to change things. They were on offense, and they were trying to change the status quo. And my position was, if I could get to the point where they were not presenting a compelling case, but one that had some holes in it, that perhaps we would be in a tie for credibility. And my clients benefited from any tie. I used to say we win all ties, because a tie means that the status quo is maintained. And so that was my strategic position right along.
Is PETA still around? I mean, anymore?
Yeah.
I mean, when I think PETA, I think of falafel now. I think of
PETA is still around. And again, the funny thing about PETA, they had a clear open field. Whenever they came out with anything, people pretty much acknowledged them as being legitimate, except when they were throwing red paint on people wearing fur coats. But their anti-meat and their anti-pet positions were easy to exploit. I remember, we would do some great research. We didn't just participate in yelling at people or calling them out for one thing or another.
Are you about to talk about it was in the Time magazine where I saw, right? There was this picture of a billboard prominently in the middle of Times Square, and the billboard, all it said was PETAkillsanimals.com.
Right. Well,
and then I scanned down, and there's your picture. There's an article about this campaign. What was that all about?
We did great research, and one of the things that you would typically do if you were in our shop is that you would get tax returns, and you'd pore over the tax returns and see if you could glean any evidence. And in one particular tax return, we noticed that they had paid a lot of money for a refrigerator, and it was a lot of money. And so we asked somebody in the refrigeration business, how big of a refrigerator, what size refrigerator costs this much money? He said, oh, that's a pretty big refrigerator. Well, that led us to understand that they were killing animals. They were euthanizing animals. People brought animals to the PETA headquarters for one reason or another, thinking that it was a shelter. And, PETA would say, we'll take care of your animal. Well, they were killing them. They were euthanizing them. And then, it's a long story, but then we put up a website called PETAkillsanimals.com. And we had billboards in Times Square. Said PETAkillsanimals.com. That, of course, then put them on their back foot. Then you got media attention that there is another side to the story. That became the soft underbelly of PETA. You could go after them on that issue and that issue alone. And that, of course, as I say, put them on their, back heels. And then we would take that information, and we did this with most of the campaigns that we participated in, whether drunk driving campaigns, fake meat campaigns, minimum wage campaigns, healthcare campaigns. We would always know that there was some soft underbelly with all these groups, and they were overreaching and they were exaggerating the need to do something, and their solution was definitely an overreach. You're always restricted by the amount of money that you have, but we're pretty clever about figuring out where we could get opportunities to broadcast a message. And that, of course, would compromise PETA, not with their diehard contributors. People who are moderate in their thinking would be willing to say, you know what, this group isn't really what we thought it was. And as I say, in that case, we win all ties. Humane Society, the same thing. And, you know, quite frankly, the Humane Society would give people the impression that they were connected to local shelters. And again, with tax returns and other information that we were able to glean from local shelters, we figured out that HSUS would give less than 1% of their huge budget, you know, $150 million budget, less than 1% to local shelters. And people thought otherwise. You know, our polling told us that. So we made that the centerpiece of our campaign against the Humane Society.
Most everyone would like to help homeless pets. They desperately need money for food and shelter. But the Humane Society of the United States takes millions of our donations to fund their huge salaries and executive pensions. If you want to help our friends, give to your local shelter, not the Humane Society of the United States. Learn more at helppetshelters.com.
It really killed their fundraising.
And that was back, I mean, when you, what year did you start Berman and Company?
Oh, well, I mean, if you want to do quick math, it's about 38 years ago.
Okay. And was your approach, because you were ahead of your time, I mean, in the current environment, news and political and, you know, this social media cesspool, right? It's the punch in the face sort of approach is kind of normal, but you're ahead of your time. You know, you were deploying those tactics in the era of Morning in America and A Kindler, Gentler Nation. And was that sort of your approach from the beginning, or did that, you know, shoot the messenger, kind of break out the knives, you know, approach, you know, sort of occur over time?
Well, you know, when I first started out, you know, right out of law school, I was a labor attorney for Bethlehem Steel. And, you know, I also worked in the auto industry, and I was the director of labor law for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So I was always fighting with these labor unions one way or another. And labor unions are pretty tough. It became necessary, as far as I was concerned, to call people out and to show the hypocrisy and the lying that was endemic with some of these groups. And, you know, when I got into the restaurant industry and I was actually, you know, given the opportunity to represent a group of clients who had differing points of view on some of these labor issues as well as food issues, I thought, you know, there's two choices here. You could be in these he said, she said fights. Somebody makes an accusation, you say, well, it's not true, it's not so, they're lying. Or, and by the way, that's a totally defensive position. Or you could you could take the attitude, I'm going to go on offense, which is always something that's more comfortable for me. And if you have the money to do it, you have people who support you, you go on offense and you change the debate. That was always my mantra, you know, to change the debate. Don't debate with people on their terms, create new terms that they have to defend against. And that's an offense. And when you get there, then you have to be aggressive. And so whether you would call it smash mouth or you would just point out hypocrisy, in either case, in both cases, you kind of use the tactic that's necessary at the time. You know, if you're going after MAD, you can't go after, you know, a group of people who are bereaved because, you know, a relative got killed in an automobile accident. You can't start attacking those people like you can attack the head of the building trades in New York City. I went after the labor unions in New York City. I'm talking about all the building trades. They're all in the same group, like they're, you know, the Union Trade Association.
Building trades in New York are kind of a risky group to go after, right?
Yeah, well, it was pretty tough, and they sued me, and you know, it got pretty nasty. But you know what? at the end of the day, they conceded.
So you got your start. So you went to William and Mary Law School. You end up as a lawyer for Bethlehem Steel. You move over to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as the head of their labor law, labor policy, and somehow you end up working in the restaurant industry. How did that happen?
Yeah, that was pretty strange. And by the way, in between Bethlehem and the chamber, I did work for the Dana Corporation, which is in the automotive space. And there I dealt with the UAW, United Auto Workers, which is a little bit like the steel union, same kind of situation. But yes, I went to the Chamber of Commerce in the labor law section. And that's when I really had my eyes opened as to who was making a difference in Washington, where the power was in Washington. And the power wasn't with trade associations. It was all with these interest groups that had sprung up, ever since the internet came online, which was, in the early 90s. All these groups were raising money on the internet and they were changing public opinion. And told the clients at the time, look, I can keep going up to Capitol Hill and I could keep lobbying people. But the real power now is among people who create public opinion. And, legislators are going to have to pay attention to public opinion. And that public opinion, for the most part, didn't exist before the internet. Regional newspapers, regional, even national television. If you think about it, half an hour of news at night, how many issues did people really ever hear about? So our client said, yeah, okay, get involved with public opinion. And that became, what we did. So when I'm working at the chamber, I did get a call from a headhunter. He convinced me to take a flyer and go down to Dallas and talk to steak and ale people. And I went down there and I met all the people. I met Norm Brinker and I was totally impressed. And long story short, there is I accepted the job. And then about a week before I was supposed to report for work, I got called down there for a meeting, an important meeting. I thought it was kind of crazy because I was going to be down there the next week. And I went into this meeting and the president of Pillsbury, the chairman of Pillsbury, and Norman had this joint meeting and they were talking about how Norman was selling all of his stock to Pillsbury in a stock-to-stock deal. And what it said to me was I was now going to be working for Pillsbury, which was totally anathema to me because that's the one thing I didn't like about corporate experience I'd had so far. Companies are big and staid and, they're just not.
They're like government, right? They're big and move slow and bureaucratic.
Yeah, right. They move slow and they're very conservative. They didn't want to, get aggressive. But what I liked about Steak and Ale and what I liked about Norman and that team is that they were willing to do whatever was necessary. So, so I went back to Washington and I called them up and I said, look, if Pillsbury's in the picture, I'm out of it. we somehow figured out how to unscramble the omelet. And then about 6 months passed. In the intervening period of time, I'd been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. My prognosis was 1 out of 3 chances of survival in the next 5 years. And when I was going through that process, I promised myself as soon as I recovered that I was going to take the next good job that came along and I was going to get out of Washington because I didn't know how much longer I was going to live. And I just wanted to do something different. And while I was there in recovery, that headhunter called me back and he said, I'm having trouble finding somebody to take your place. Norman, was somehow enamored with what I had told him. And he said, I got to find your clone. He said, you'd make my job a lot easier if you would reconsider. I said, you called on the right day. And so we changed the deal. Part of the deal was I told Norman, I'm not going to take this job unless the people at Pillsbury are not going to come down on me for something that I'm doing that they disagree with. And I had a dotted line relationship to the general counsel, to the government affairs department, as well as human resources. And Norman said, promise you, this won't happen. He was good for that because from time to time, those guys would get upset with me over something. And I would just go to Norman and say, look, you got you got to intervene, and he did. He was the single largest stockholder of Pillsbury stock, so it wasn't very difficult for him to be the biggest canary in the room. But as things would have it, Norman was head of the Pillsbury Restaurant Group, which was Burger King and Steak and Ale and Bennigan's and a couple of other cats and dogs, and at one point, Norman goes to the Pillsbury board and he says, I want to buy this small restaurant company, bring them under our umbrella. They've only got about 20 stores. Maybe it was 20 max. And the board said, no, it's too expensive. So Norman left the board, left the company and bought it himself. And that little company was Chili's. And of course, Norman took Chili's to much greater heights than a 20 restaurant company. But when Norman left, the firewall left, and those guys at Pillsbury rediscovered me. And so I just decided I wasn't going to spend the rest of my time at Steak and Ale if I was back working for Pillsbury, because that's what I had said I wasn't going to do in the first place. And so I talked to my new boss, who took over for Norman, a guy by the name of Jeff Campbell, now a professor out at San Diego State, but he had been the chairman of Burger King. Jeff's a great guy. And I told Jeff I wanted to quit. And he told me no, and I told him why. And he said, well, I'll help you quit if that's what you really want to do. And so they gave me a very nice severance package. They gave me a 3-year contract and to represent them. Their deal was you can do what you used to do, but don't do it in our name. And after 1 year of exclusive representation, I could represent other companies. And so I did. After 1 year, I had, as I say, about 17 restaurant companies that I was working for. And that's the group that I then decided could do better for themselves if I was not just going up to Capitol Hill all the time, talking to people about why they should or shouldn't think a certain way. And I would spend more time trying to influence public opinion, who in turn, because grassroots was becoming a big deal, they in turn would lobby members of Congress, and they in turn were constituents. I wasn't a constituent.
So you mentioned trade associations, how they did things differently than you. That sort of, you separated yourself just in your approach. And I remember when I first started with the restaurant industry, with the restaurant association, I was brought on as the chief lobbyist and came from a lobbying job in the manufacturing sector. So I didn't know a lot about the restaurant industry issues or the associations, but I got 2 conflicting pieces of advice when I first joined the association. I inherited sort of a big fight. We were sort of running a massive campaign to push back against the original Obamacare, which would have forced small businesses to pay for 100% of their employees' health coverage. But the conflicting advice I got was, first, stay away from that Rick Berman guy. And the other piece of advice was, as I was trying to raise a lot of money to run a campaign, was you need the big players nationally in the restaurant industry, and the only way to get to them is through Rick Berman. And so that's this was 20 years ago when I first met you, and I don't know if you remember this, but I get on the plane to go kiss the ring of the guy that was going to hopefully help us in this campaign fight. And the guy that was running the campaign, our campaign manager, was like, on the plane ride back to DC, he's like, don't grovel too much, and don't show any weakness, and don't let him think that you need him. And of course, we get to DC, and we go to I think it was Ocean Air, which is where you were, had always your own reserve table, and you were holding court at the time. And I sat down. The first thing I said to you was, "We need you. We need you if we're going to succeed in this campaign. Are you willing to help us? We need to raise a bunch of money." And I remember after that dinner, we closed the place down, and it's me and this campaign manager sitting out, on an empty, dark street, waiting for the taxi cab to go pick us up, and he lights up a cigarette and doesn't say anything to me. He looks at me, he's like, "We need you." And like, and that was like my first, sort of meeting you way back in the day. But yeah, we were told that trade associations don't approach things the way Rick Berman does. And I remember Dick Rivera describing sort of the difference in approach that you have versus trade associations. And he basically said, well, the difference between trade associations and what Rick Berman does is, Rick Berman has a knife in his teeth, and the trade associations don't. So,
all true. And I do remember that meeting. More importantly, I remember doing what I could to raise the money for you because I was very impressed with you. I knew a lot of the people who were running trade associations at the state level, and for the most part, I have to say I was not impressed. In fact, all through my years, there were very few. Every so often, I would meet somebody at one of the state level associations, but for the most part, it wasn't the best and the brightest, to be honest. And you think about it, if you're running the California Restaurant Association, you're running a pretty big business. But most of these guys were not in that situation. And when I met you, I knew that I had met somebody who I was compatible with and who kind of got the joke, whereas a lot of people were not in favor of any sort of aggressive outreach. And here you were raising big money. I mean, most people didn't do that. So I was more than happy to help. And
yeah. Do you remember? I remember distinctly. You would be flying around the country meeting with the major players, who had the ability to contribute to a campaign. And you would call me and say, meet me at the Sacramento airport. And I'd drive out there and you would fly in, you'd come out to the curb, you'd hand me an envelope, a really thick envelope with a ton of checks, turn back around, get back on a plane and fly back. And that happened a couple of times. It was amazing.
Yeah, well, everybody was concerned about the healthcare issue, but you gave me the confidence to flack for you because if I thought that you could do the job, then I would say that to my clients, and they trusted me. I will say I don't know how I got so much earned trust. I think, quite frankly, a lot of it was because of Norman. Norman was my biggest fan, and when I left the company, he was my first client. And if it weren't for Norman, I don't know that my life would have turned out the way it did. But people just believed in what I was telling them, and I'd like to say that I think I did enough things that they thought that was trust that was validated by results. And so raising money for you and quite frankly, raising money for a lot of other things that we did, later on. I mean, I raised, I want to say close to $30 million for that one campaign against card check. Now, admittedly, that did not come out of the restaurant industry. In fact, when I asked the Restaurant Association for some money, the board turned me down. And the board turned me down for a reason which is typical. Some people in a big trade association are passive players, some are aggressive players. The difference is the DNA that these people have in their system, and some people just are going to veto any aggressive move. And so that's why when I was representing clients, I only represented people who agreed with the approach that I was going to take. And so you always got a strange group of people. I mean, McDonald's would never help me. Because I was too aggressive for McDonald's. McDonald's franchisees might feel differently, or a couple of people in the McDonald's staff felt differently, but for the most part, they wouldn't help. So, not a lot of these guys who are running restaurants are visionaries. You get guys like Dave Brandon, who was super visionary, one of the coolest guys I'd met in the restaurant business. People like Norman, you mentioned Dick Rivera is another one. And certainly there are plenty others, but for the most part, the trade association business is not designed to play hardball. They're not into the offense business. They're into the defense. The offense of the trade association was to make people feel good about going out to restaurants. I never thought that was a good expenditure of money, but, they have big campaigns to say, come to restaurants. If people want to come to restaurants, they don't need a campaign to tell them to do that. But that was the default position for the board. Let's talk about restaurants until somebody attacks us, and then we'll say, that's not fair, that's not right. And I would say, well, wait a second, let's undress these people and show the public just who it is that is claiming that you should not eat meat, that you should not have a drink before you drive. And, the list of issues goes on and on. But
Rick, I need to ask you about the relationship you had with George McGovern. Some time ago, you had mentioned to me about a fascinating dinner you had with Norm Brinker, James Carville, and George McGovern, which I wish I would fly on the wall for that dinner. But that's a unique relationship you had with a, pretty, back in the day, liberal, former presidential candidate who you developed a pretty good relationship with. How did that come about?
Well, like a lot of other things that happen in life, it was just coincidental. I had read that morning a story about McGovern going bankrupt in a bed and breakfast. I think it was up in Connecticut. And it was just one of these human interest stories. And I mentioned it to this woman who I was with that morning, who was a fundraiser for the Democratic Party. And I said to her, you see, even people who are in Congress, find out that what people have been telling them about business difficulties is true, except that he wasn't in Congress anymore. And she said, well, would you like to meet McGovern? And I said, oh, I'd love that. She said, well, he's a friend of mine. Let me set it up. So I went to McGovern's office. We connected really well. I have to say that it was one of those first meetings where, the chemistry is right. And so I went out on a limb and I said, after he told me, first person, all the difficulties he had in the restaurant business, I said, if you wanted to write a story about that in your own words, I think that would be incredible. Of course, I knew that would be incredible for my clients as well. And he said, well, sure, people ghostwrite stuff for, senators and presidents and congressmen all the time. So I wrote this piece in his voice, what I thought was his voice, but, definitely made the case.
With very famous, it's still to this day, I think you can find that on the internet.
After I wrote it, I met him for lunch at the Palm, which is where that meeting was with Garville and McGovern and Brinker and myself. The essence of what happened is that I gave him the piece to look at. For the most part, he liked it. He changed a word or two, and he gave it to the Wall Street Journal. They ran it. The rest is history. I mean, that got put in the Congressional Record at least 20 times. And people would say to me all the time, knowing that I was in the restaurant business, as an attorney for the industry. In fact, people used to think I worked for the Restaurant Association. And I'd say, no, I don't work for the association. But people would say to me all the time, did you see that article that George McGovern wrote? And I would go, yes, I did see that. And, that went on for years. I think this is the first time I've ever said that I wrote it. And quite frankly, I wrote other stuff for him. He wrote some other stuff. He liked the fact that in the middle of the night in London, the Wall Street Journal called him up. They'd gotten the submission, but they called him up and they said, did you actually submit this? Did you write this? And he said, yes. And they ran it in the Wall Street Journal. And as they say, it got replicated many times over.
So that relationship, because you had mentioned card check, and I know that was a massive lift and a huge fight, and you raised a boatload of money, but you kind of give him credit for the failure of the card check.
Yeah, I do. I did raise a bunch of money, tens of millions of dollars. It was a campaign that went on, quite frankly, for 3 years, and it all came down to the Senate. I mean, it passed overwhelmingly in the House. And, if it had passed, this restaurant industry would be unionized today. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But it passed the House by a great margin. And then, of course, by that point, we had a full campaign going on, funded by people who kind of got the joke and who understood that this was what, you had to go against the labor unions. You had to really make it tough on them. And then it got to the Senate, and the only way it was going to stop in the Senate was with a filibuster. And it was dicey as to whether or not we could beat them. And I saw George, and he would come to town on an occasion, and we would have a drink in my office. We'd have a glass of wine in my office. And I said to him one day, I said, you know what your friends are doing? And he said, no. And I said, I went through this whole thing about how they were going to take away the secret ballot election in union organizing campaigns. And he said, oh, no, they're not going to do that. He said, that would be undemocratic. And I said, well, they are going to do that. It doesn't look like that the way they write the law, but that's what's going to happen. And so that's where the conversation ended. And anyway, he came back a few weeks later and he said, by the way, I did talk to some of my colleagues, my ex-colleagues, and he said, you're right. That's exactly what they're doing. The unions want to get this passed, and they've been trying to pass this for many years. And it was going to reverse the union's fortunes, not only in the restaurant industry, but in general, because, their membership rates were very low, at least in the private sector. So I just said to him, because we had done a lot of videos, I said, if you feel strongly about it, how about doing a video? Despite all the millions of dollars that we spent, that made the difference. It was clear that the iconic George McGovern in the Midwest froze a lot of Democrat senators, and they were not going to cross over to the union side when McGovern had said, this is not democracy.
I'm concerned about a bill in Congress that would effectively eliminate an employee's right to a private vote when deciding whether to join a union. It's hard to believe that any politician would agree to a law denying millions of employees the right to a private vote. I've always been a champion of labor unions, but I fear that today's union leaders are turning their backs on democratic workplace elections. I've listened to all their arguments and reviewed the facts on both sides. Quite simply, this proposed law cannot be justified. Working families deserve a voice and a private vote. I'm Senator George McGovern, and I approve this message because democracy is something that should never be sacrificed.
For more information on keeping democracy alive, go to employeefreedom.org.
Fascinating. What is your approach to sort of advocacy and public affairs and, that knife in the teeth approach? Is that in your DNA? Like, where did you grow up?
You never know why you are who you are. But I grew up in the Bronx, Queens.
Okay. All right. Makes sense.
I have to say, it is kind of funny, even as a little kid, I remember, about probably 7, 8 years old. We didn't have very much money. I mean, I lived in one of those apartment buildings that you sometimes see in a movie where the fire escapes are on the front side of the building, and it's an old building. I went to the same grade school that my mother went to. The whole thing was kind of locked in time. There was an empty lot not very far from our house, from our apartment building, and what we did as kids is we threw rocks at each other. That was the game that we had. I mean, nobody had toys. We didn't even have toy guns or water guns or anything else like that. Just throwing rocks at each other. We went from the Bronx to Queens. My dad ran a gas station, but I will say that being around people who came out of New York City, I was around people who were pretty tough. Considering that they could, that they could feel comfortable getting into a fight. People got into fights all the time. And I was comfortable with that. I mean, I remember, people would ask me from time to time when I was in Washington, did I mind being attacked? I was attacked, like you say, the Dr. Evil thing from the rest, from the unions, and there was other groups that just really hated me for whatever it was I was trying to do, which was basically untrack their agenda. And I would say, look, they could call me names all they want to. I said, if that's the worst thing that ever happened to me, it would be nothing compared to some of the stuff that I experienced, growing up. So, even
Okay, so that sort of aggressive, punch them in the nose. Don't be afraid to get in this in a brawl as probably that built or at least to some degree foundational from where you grew up, the neighborhood people.
I basically know who Trump is because he's just a grown-up version of a lot of guys that I used to hang around with in Queens.
Well, Rick, this has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you joining us for the Confidential Bulletin podcast.
Well, it's been fun for me.